It is the autumn of 218 BC, and an army drawn from every corner of the ancient world fights its way across the Alps. Already it's a shell of its former self, perhaps 30,000 out of the original 100,000 or more. United by sheer force of will, Phoenicians, Libyans, and Spaniards brave slippery mountain paths, Illyric slingers scale steep cliffs, and Numidian horsemen ride on ahead. Lumbering beside them in sight of Hannibal himself are the war elephants, making for a scene that beasts and riders would not soon forget. Besides the snowfall, landslides, and 1,000-foot drops, Hannibal's men also had to contend with a powerful tribe of Gauls nipping at their heels. In the end, they triumphed over the forces of man and nature alike, just as they had in the Pyrenees, just as they had on the Rhone. After 16 grueling days, their Alpine crossing was over. Now the fertile plains of Italy lay ripe for the taking. Beyond them, the ultimate prize, the eternal city of Rome. "2,018 years later, in the spring of 1800, a different army crosses the Alps. It is the army of Napoleon, who trails behind the 51,400 Frenchmen as they cross the Great St. Bernard. While their commander attends to logistics, the army of France sets off at dawn each day to reduce the threat of the midday avalanche. Lugging along guns and cannon, they press on, 10,000 horses and 750 mules straining under the weight. In just 11 days, their journey is complete. When Napoleon bolts off to join them, he rides a horse for most of the journey, but switches to a mule during the icy ascent near Saint Pierre. In one painting, the future emperor is shown on just such a mule, but in the version Napoleon himself commissions from Jacques-Louis David, he appears in all his glory. Seated majestically on a rearing piebald horse, Napoleon, with his famous bicorn hat, points toward the mountain summit beyond which Marengo awaits. It's among his most iconic portraits, one we've all seen at one point or another. But look closer and you may spot something you haven't noticed before. There, etched into the rock, the name Bonaparte. Next to him, Carolus Magnus. And between them, worn away by time, the most ancient name of the three, Hannibal. This is the story of two lives lived in parallel, the life of Hannibal and the life of Napoleon. Two of history's greatest captains, great enough to be referred to by their first names alone. On the field of battle, both repeatedly beat the odds, and their strategies and tactics are still studied at military academies today. Both were masters of the turning movement, and at one point or another, both commanded broad multi-ethnic forces. Both enveloped their enemies, both crossed the Alps, and both were men of destiny. But when fortune turned against them, both died in exile. Yet neither ever doubted his place among the greats, and both liked to compare themselves to the greatest of them all, Alexander. And why not? Each had mastered the art of war and reshaped military strategy in his image. Had they traded places, chances are both would have gotten pretty far in the other's shoes, and maybe even in Alexander's. But would their fate have been avoided, their exile and defeat overturned? I don't know, but I think these parallels come together to form three defining themes. Three lessons we can all take away from the lives of Hannibal and Napoleon. The first, fortune favors the bold. Above all qualities, Hannibal and Napoleon valued audacity. Hannibal even says as much to his arch-rival Scipio during his exile in the Seleucid Empire. Per the Greek historian Appian, Scipio asked Hannibal whom he considered the greatest general, to which the latter replied, "Alexander of Macedon." Then he asked Hannibal whom he placed next, and he replied, "Pyrrhus of Epirus," because he considered boldness the first qualification of a general. "For it would not be possible," he said, "to find two kings more enterprising than these." Needless to say, Hannibal also walked the walk. What was his march from Spain to Italy, if not one of the boldest maneuvers in military history, the simple but daring solution to Roman naval supremacy? Consider that before Hannibal's army even reached the Alps, it had to cross the Pyrenees and the Rhone, all while repelling wave after wave of Gauls. By the time the army got there, 2/3 of the men were gone, claimed by death, desertion, or other causes. Sooner or later, every army reaches its breaking point, even Alexander's had in India. So how is it that Hannibal got his men to push on? Honestly, it can be a little hard to say. Most of what we know about Hannibal and about the Carthaginians in general comes from their mortal enemy. What we do know is that many of Hannibal's men had long campaigned in Spain, first under his father, then his brother-in-law, then under Hannibal himself. In a personal address to the soldiers, Hannibal reminded them of their previous victories and appealed to their sense of honor, pride, and dignity. "For all these many years," he told them, "you have campaigned with me and never lost a battle. Yet now, when you can see that most of the journey is completed, when we have traversed the high passes of the Pyrenees and conquered the wildest tribes that dwell amongst them, when we have crossed the mighty river Rhone in the teeth of opposition from 100,000 Gauls and tamed that river's force to make our crossing, when even now the Alps are right before our eyes and Italy only just beyond, now on the very doorsteps of our enemies, you want to stop? What on earth do you think the Alps are except the collection of high mountains? Nothing on earth can ever reach the sky. No mountain is too high for man to conquer." These words were recorded by the Roman historian Livy, and though it was the habit of his ilk to invent speeches on behalf of the enemy, I think this one captures the essence of Hannibal well. Here was someone who refused to believe anything was impossible. Someone willing to take tens of thousands of men, horses, elephants into the very beating heart of enemy territory. Someone willing, as I have said before, to take the straight line path to his goal. The Romans were dominant at sea? Fine, then he would go by land, finding a path or making one. It was precisely that sort of thinking that enabled Rome to win the First Punic War, to build a navy from scratch after reverse engineering a Carthaginian quinquereme. Perhaps that is why Livy understood Hannibal so well, and perhaps that is why another man, who invoked the Romans often, understood Hannibal also. "This most daring of all men," Napoleon called Hannibal, "perhaps the most astonishing. So bold, so assured, so broad of vision in all things, who at the age of 26 conceives what is scarcely conceivable and carries out what was deemed impossible." Much the same could be said of the Little Corporal. In 1800, as we know, he crossed the Alps as consul of France, this during the War of the Second Coalition. But before that, during the First Coalition War, the as it happens 26-year-old Bonaparte was sent to conquer Italy on behalf of the French Directory. The only problem? The army of Italy was short on men, equipment, and food, making Napoleon's chutzpah about the only thing they had in sufficient supply. "Soldiers," he proclaimed, "you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much, it can give you nothing. Your patience, the courage you exhibit in the midst of these rocks are admirable, but they give you no glory. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you shall find honor, fame, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, shall courage or constancy fail you? Within 2 months, Napoleon and his men had taken Milan and defeated the Austrians at Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, and elsewhere. Only the following year, the seemingly unwinnable War of the First Coalition was brought to an end on favorable terms to France. Throughout it all, the little corporal, as he came to be called after the Battle of Lodi, bore every hardship, every hazard that he asked of his troops. By then, he had a reputation for doing so. During the Siege of Toulon in 1793, Napoleon was wounded in his left thigh, displaying then all the physical courage that he would show in Italy. Despite promising the Directory by letter that he wouldn't expose himself to unnecessary dangers, just 2 days later he led a famous charge at the Battle of Arcole. Though the maneuver proved ineffective, nearly costing Napoleon his life, it would not soon be forgotten by the soldiers who witnessed it, who proved their devotion in later years by following Napoleon to the ends of the earth, or at least the ends of Europe. The thing about Napoleon was that he had an almost preternatural grasp on how to embolden those around him. Not only did he lead by example, he also knew how to push all the right buttons. In command of a particularly vulnerable position at Toulon, Napoleon lacked volunteers until he renamed it the Battery of Men Without Fear. Suddenly, the volunteers were pouring in, an invaluable lesson to the 24-year-old artillery officer. Later, as consul, he laid bare his understanding of the Frenchman's psychology. "You call these medals and ribbons baubles," he told a sneering member of the Council of State. "Well, it is with such baubles that men are led. The French are not changed by 10 years of revolution. They are what the Gauls were, fierce and fickle." With the incisive perspective of an outsider, Napoleon knew that, like their Gallic forefathers, the Frenchmen of his day wanted to be recognized, rewarded, honored for their courage. And he also knew that courage was infectious, which is why he often led from the front and kept a cool head while doing it. On more than one occasion, men would die literally right beside him. Before the Battle of Wagram, one officer barely escaped just such a fate, having lost his helmet, but not his head, to a cannonball. Napoleon was so used to that kind of thing that he even cracked a joke about the officer's height, pretty rich, coming from him. On that same occasion, he was sufficiently brave, or perhaps overworked, to take one of his signature 10-minute siestas, lulled to sleep by the sound of 700 cannons. Needless to say, Napoleon was a pretty courageous guy. But he also differentiated between two different types of courage, between physical courage and 2 o'clock in the morning courage. What he meant by the latter was unprepared courage, that which is necessary on an unexpected occasion, and which, in spite of the most unforeseen events, leaves full freedom of judgment and decision. Napoleon and Hannibal had this quality in spades, an absolute necessity for someone leading an army. War, after all, is a messy business, chaotic and unpredictable. As Clausewitz teaches us, it is less like a science, even less like an art, and much more akin to a game. And as Clausewitz would remind us, few understood this better than Napoleon. Though he planned meticulously, Napoleon wasn't afraid to drop his plans at a moment's notice. He no doubt would have agreed with the saying that while plans are useless, planning is indispensable. What mattered to Napoleon was winning. "There is no man more pusillanimous than I when I am planning a campaign," he once said. "I purposely exaggerate all the dangers and all the calamities that the circumstances make possible. But once I have made up my mind, everything is forgotten except what leads to success." In other words, a bit of the 2 o'clock in the morning courage, the kind you need when jolted awake to be given the worst news imaginable. Such moments demand you keep a level head, adapt as necessary, and work like the devil to put out the fire. But first and foremost, they require you to be bold. Where this audacity came from is an intriguing question. My guess, in the case of Hannibal and Napoleon alike, is a strong sense of self tinged with destiny. It is said of Hannibal that as a child his father held him over a flame and made him swear never to be a friend of Rome. "I swear so soon as age will permit," vowed the boy, "I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome." Napoleon had similar musings when he was still toying with the idea of being a Corsican revolutionary. He proclaimed that he was born when Corsica was perishing. 30,000 Frenchmen spewed onto our shores, drowning the throne of liberty in waves of blood. The cries of the dying, the groans of the oppressed, and tears of despair surrounded my cradle from the hour of my birth. Though his loyalties would change, Napoleon always believed that destiny had marked him out from the cradle, and throughout his life his almost unfailing streak of good luck all but confirms this. While sailing to Egypt, he eluded the fleet of Horatio Nelson by a matter of hours. He was saved from a terrorist plot after his drunk coachman took a wrong turn. He narrowly eluded a group of Cossacks in Russia, and just when he thought that fate was done with him, the poison he swallowed before his first abdication proved ineffective. When deliberating important military appointments, Napoleon would often ask in complete seriousness whether the officer in question was lucky. He also referred to his first wife Josephine as his star, so it may not be completely coincidental, whether for reasons of fate or psychology, that Napoleon's decline began after their divorce. In any case, the precise qualities that made Napoleon and Hannibal such active, enterprising generals also contributed to their ruin. Fundamentally, these were men who did not know when to stop, did not know when to give in. A fact which leads us to lesson number 2. Never be afraid to fight a losing battle. What did Hannibal hope to accomplish once he had crossed the Alps? He had lost 2/3 of his army to get here, and his opponents had both the numerical and the home ground advantage. Yet Hannibal thought he only had to kick in the door before the whole rotten structure came crashing down. He thought that he could dislocate Rome from the rest of Italy, and that the other cities in the peninsula would break away and join his side after he'd won a victory or two. But though Hannibal won again and again, his strategy proved to be chimeric. Rome, with its peninsular confederation, its multi-cameral republic, and its expansionary citizenship program, had new and dynamic institutions. Institutions that were clearly working, if the outcome of the First Punic War was any indication. The outcome of that conflict was far from a foregone conclusion, but by the Second Punic War, Rome represented the future, while Carthage represented the past. Already this ancient sea power had lost its greatest advantage, and it lacked the institutions that made Rome so resilient. Sure, Carthage had a republic, but a path to confederate or citizenship status for outsiders? Forget it. The Carthaginians had no way of creating more Carthaginians, at least not besides the good old-fashioned way, which took too long. But did any of that stop Hannibal? Absolutely not. He was, as Napoleon would be, the last best hope against an up-and-coming superpower. And had Rome misplayed its winning hand, who knows? Maybe Carthage would have triumphed after all. Hannibal's Alpine crossing took the Romans completely by surprise, forcing them to cancel their own invasion of Carthage. The two sides finally met in a large-scale cavalry skirmish at Ticinus, with Hannibal reminding his men beforehand that they had nowhere to run. Naturally, this made them fight like their lives depended on it, and they won their first victory. This they then followed up at the Battle of Trebia. That battle was the first major engagement of the Second Punic War, very much setting the tone for the next 2 years to follow. After an icy river crossing at dawn, the Romans walked right into the beast's lair, where Hannibal's forces enveloped them completely. By now, Hannibal had replenished his ranks with local defectors and thousands of Gauls, fierce and fickle and seeking to settle old scores with Rome. All the same, the Eternal City, as well as the majority of its Italian allies, held firm. Weeks later, a new Roman army marched out under the command of Gaius Flaminius, and once again, Hannibal was waiting. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in military history, obliterating Flaminius' army, killing the general himself, and sending shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Surely now, after 2 major defeats, the Italian Confederates would break away. Surely now, the door would fall in. But it didn't. The structure held firm, and Rome stayed in the fight. Instead of sending more armies to their death, though, the Senate appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus, whose entire strategy was not to fight. He shadowed Hannibal, harassed his supply lines, refused open battle. It must have been infuriating. Hannibal had crossed the Alps, won every engagement, but he couldn't get his elusive enemy to fight, let alone treat with him. Thankfully for Hannibal, by 216 BC, Rome had grown tired of being wise. Fabius' term as dictator ended, and the Senate sent another army to Cannae. Polybius tells us it was the greatest Roman army ever assembled, probably numbering 86,000 including the Italian allies. Hannibal's army only numbered 50,000, but due to his tactical brilliance, he was able to lure the Romans into the greatest trap yet, a double envelopment. As many as 50,000 Romans are said to have perished, including 80 senators, or about 1/3 of Rome's ruling class. The rest were mostly captured. Not only was this a crisis without precedent, it was one of the bloodiest single days of warfare in all of history, comparable in scale to the battles of the Napoleonic and First World Wars. So, what happened next? We'll get to that in the last section of this video. For now, we turn to Napoleon. Like Hannibal, Napoleon was a representative of the old order up against the new. In his case, an unlikely representative, since he wasn't French but Corsican and came to power by merit rather than birthright. I don't mean to diminish Napoleon's modernizing legacy, which in itself could be a whole separate video. My point is simply that on the eve of the Napoleonic Wars, the dynamic between France and the United Kingdom did not look all that different from that of Carthage and Rome, respectively. Though Napoleon worked inhumanly hard to lay down lasting institutions, or masses of granite as he called them, his efforts ultimately proved too little too late. The United Kingdom had the superior navy, an enduring parliamentary system, a relatively stable constitutional monarchy, and a dynamic market economy. It was well positioned for the positive-sum world to emerge out of the 19th century, world that Napoleon's all-or-nothing mind could scarcely compass. After the War of the First Coalition, when the French Directory was still in charge, Napoleon nearly lost everything: his reputation, his army, his life, during his expedition to Egypt. And as for his navy, he lost that at the Battle of the Nile. There, 27 ships of the line decided the outcome of the Egyptian campaign, 14 of them British and 13 French. In the aftermath, most of the French vessels were captured, the flagship destroyed, and the French vice admiral's body, or whatever remained of it, doomed to a watery grave. Scrambling, Napoleon left his troops behind and returned to Europe, where during his absence the Austrians had overrun French positions in Italy. With the government growing more unpopular than ever, Napoleon displayed his ability to convert defeat into victory by toppling the Directory and becoming first consul. With domestic affairs in hand, he set his sights on Italy, and it is at this point that he crosses the Alps and nearly loses everything again at the Battle of Marengo. Quoting from biographer Andrew Roberts, Napoleon had previously asked his secretary where he thought the decisive battle would be fought. "How the devil should I know?" he answered, to which Napoleon replied, "Why, look here, you fool," pointing to the plains of the river Scrivia at San Giuliano Vecchio. It was precisely there that the Battle of Marengo was fought 3 months later. But for all his foresight in predicting the battlefield, the battle itself was a near-run thing. The day was only saved with the hasty arrival of succeeding waves of French reinforcements. Yet even if the victory was a narrow one, it ensured the survival of the Napoleonic regime and culminated in his imperial coronation in 1804. After the War of the Third Coalition broke out the following year, it basically followed the established pattern: a disastrous reversal at sea and stunning victories on land. The Battle of Trafalgar not only squashed any hope of a French invasion of England, It also confirmed British naval supremacy for the next century, a century eventually to be known as the Pax Britannica. Quoting once more from Andrew Roberts, Napoleon's understanding of naval affairs was dismal. He never truly grasped that the British ability to fire broadsides far more often per minute made the sheer number of ships in any engagement largely irrelevant, and that blockading France at sea strengthened rather than weakened British fighting ability. The story on the continent, however, could not be more different. Napoleon won two of his greatest victories during this very war, outmaneuvering the Austrians at Ulm and playing them and the Russians like a fiddle at Austerlitz. Throughout his military career, Napoleon was consistently outnumbered and outgunned, but few could keep up with an army moving as fast as his. As per Napoleon's own calculations, the Grande Armée moved at twice the speed of Caesar's legions. Pretty impressive when you consider that Caesar never had to worry about transporting field guns. To maximize speed, Napoleon relied on better roads, lighter artillery, and smaller supply trains. In Italy, he was in his prime. His army was able to requisition supplies from the wealthy locals and didn't need to wait on convoys of food. They could also move faster by virtue of Napoleon's greatest contribution to the art of war. That is, the corps system, which allowed groups of divisions or corps to function with autonomy. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, logistics, and intelligence, allowing it to enter into battle and survive long enough for more corps to pile in. Interestingly, some of these organizational decisions are the very ones that Hannibal opted for thousands of years ago. Obviously, this was way before the corps system, but Hannibal's troops were seasoned and fast-moving, and like Napoleon, he marched through the Alps, which, even if dangerous, was the fastest path to his objective. Speed, then, was the starting point of Napoleon and Hannibal's successes, but both eventually came face to face with an enemy almost immune to their strategy, bringing us to lesson number 3. After the Battle of Cannae, Rome was as close to giving up as it ever would be. The Sibylline books were studied, the Delphine oracle consulted, and 4 people buried alive in a rare instance of human sacrifice. But still, the Romans refused to negotiate, even on behalf of the prisoners who had been taken at Cannae. Instead, they formed 2 new legions after opening the ranks to youngsters, slaves, and criminals. Even more importantly, they learned not to doubt Fabius again. The Cunctator, or delayer, was dictator once again, if only unofficially. Even so, his word was law. Pitched battles were avoided, a scorched earth policy adopted, and Hannibal harassed by smaller forces rather than a big one. This ensured the invader lacked the men and material necessary to besiege Rome herself. Nor would Carthage ever supply Hannibal with what he needed because he had largely acted on his own initiative, just as Napoleon had under the Directory. This made both figures a threat to the oligarchs back home. But whereas Napoleon took charge for himself after the coup of Brumaire, Hannibal would not get his shot at political power until after the Second Punic War. There was at least this consolation. The Italian allies were finally faltering. Polybius tells us that before the fateful day at Cannae, their loyalty remained unshaken, but now it began to waver for the simple reason that they despaired of Roman power. On top of that, the First Macedonian War broke out in 214 BC. Rome made sure to tie Macedon up by sending forces to Greece, and the war there eventually ended in stalemate. In the meantime, Hannibal scored several more successes, but owing to the insufficient support of Carthage and the Italian allies, he was slowly but surely whittled down. The Fabian strategy was bearing fruit. In 207 BC, Hannibal attempted to join forces with his brother Hasdrubal in a last-ditch attempt to take Rome, only for Hasdrubal to wind up defeated at the Battle of Metaurus. In the aftermath, Rome sent Hannibal his decapitated brother's head, and that about settled things in Italy. By 203 BC, the Roman general Scipio Africanus was knocking on the door of Carthage, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his African homeland. Scipio's nickname Africanus makes it pretty clear how the confrontation ends. At the Battle of Zama, basically Hannibal's Waterloo, he's defeated by the Roman Wellington, that is, by Scipio, Fabius's swashbuckling counterpart. If Fabius was the tortoise and Hannibal the hare, then Scipio was a second hare sent to deliver the coup de grace. Many years later, when Hannibal found himself exiled in the east, he had that conversation with Scipio that I quoted from earlier. Hannibal had said that Alexander and Pyrrhus of Epirus were the two generals he considered greatest. But then Scipio asked him who he would put in third place. Can you guess how Hannibal answered? Scipio probably guessed that it would be him, but that is not what Hannibal said. "Myself," he proclaimed, "for when I was a young man I conquered Hispania and crossed the Alps with an army, the first after Hercules." After Scipio reminded him of Zama, Hannibal said that had it not been for that defeat, he would have placed himself before Alexander. After Napoleon was exiled to Elba, he would show more humility than Hannibal. "History has a triumvirate of great men," one adoring visitor told him: Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. At this, says biographer Andrew Roberts, Napoleon looked steadfastly at the visitor without speaking. The visitor thought he saw the emperor's eyes moisten. It is what he had wanted people to say ever since he was a schoolboy. Eventually, Napoleon replied, "You would be right if a ball had killed me at the Battle of Moscow, but my late reverses will efface all the glory of my early years." And that was still before Waterloo. In the meantime, Napoleon had blundered into not one, but two disastrous land invasions, all because his intended naval invasion of Britain had been rendered impossible by the French defeat at Trafalgar. So Napoleon decided on a different course of action, one he would call the Continental Blockade. It was a typically ambitious move, a continent-wide embargo on all British goods to Europe. In 1807, it led Napoleon to invade Portugal, which had continued to trade with its oldest ally. By the following year, the conflict expanded to include Spain, where Napoleon intended to install his brother Josef as king. The result was the disastrous Peninsular War, or as Napoleon preferred to call it, his Spanish Ulcer. This was the world's first modern guerrilla conflict, one that Britain aided, abetted, and reinforced. In 1808, 15,000 British soldiers arrived in Portugal under the Duke of Wellington. Tens of thousands would join them during the next 6 years that followed. Despite the stalemate in the south, Napoleon set his sights east to Russia, which had, since 1810, also resumed trading with Britain. This was, I might add, understandable, given that Russia's national debt had increased 13-fold since joining the continental system, so reliant had it been on the import of British goods. As a final note on this point, here again we see the strength of the British system. In discussions with his secretary Baron Fane, Napoleon assumed that Britain's economy would buckle under the weight. After all, it was being forced to sustain the occupation of India, the war against America, the establishments in the Mediterranean, defending Ireland and its own coasts, the garrisoning of the huge navy, and at the same time, the stubborn war in the peninsula. As would be the case during the Second World War, Britain also supported the Russians when Napoleon invaded them, pledging £1.25 million for every 100,000 Russian soldiers devoted to the war effort. The fact that Britain could afford all this is the same reason that the United States is still afloat today. It had good credit. Yet Napoleon pressed on. In 1812, he assembled the largest invasion force in history, unsurpassed until Operation Barbarossa, and crossed the Niemen River. The French invasion of Russia had begun. Just as the Romans had once disagreed about how to deal with Hannibal, the Russians now debated how to deal with Napoleon. One faction favored a direct confrontation, which is exactly what Napoleon wanted, while the other prudently advised a Fabian withdrawal into the Russian interior. Ultimately, the second faction won out after Tsar Alexander named Mikhail Kutuzov as general-in-chief. Kutuzov was the modern Fabius. "Patience and time are my warriors," he says in Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. There he is cast as a kind of anti-Napoleon. Per Tolstoy, Kutuzov never talked of 40 centuries and was content to let events follow their course, while Napoleon, driven by a grandiose idea of destiny, sought to impose his will upon the world by force. It was another example of tortoise and hare. Under Kutuzov, the Russians finally gained a united command, one of Napoleon's first dictums for the art of war. They also adopted the corps and divisional system, kept factories open overtime, created a new war ministry, reorganized the food distribution system, codified army command, and revamped the staff structure. This allowed the Russians to hold their own in the few pitched battles which took place, namely in the Battle of Borodino, where 70,000 lost their lives. That was to be the single bloodiest day of warfare until the First World War. But all told, only 40% of French losses came from Russian regular military action. The rest from disease, exposure, starvation, and partisan action. With Kutuzov's hand at the tiller, the Russians used the vastness of their country to their great advantage. They used guerrilla tactics, changing seasons, the lack of infrastructure, and disease to whittle the Grande Armée down to a shell of its former self. Contrary to popular belief, Napoleon had counted on the cold. He had read Voltaire's history of Charles XII and knew the perils of the Russian winter. The problem was that he no longer enjoyed the advantages that he did in places like Italy. There he had commanded an army united in nationality, language, and purpose in a rich and fertile country. Now it was he who commanded the coalition force, with the French accounting for only 64% of the cavalry and 48% of the infantry. Furthermore, what little Russia had was reduced to a point of non-existence by a scorched earth policy, the culmination of which was the burning of Moscow. Napoleon had never calculated on such a desperate move. "It is their own work," he said. "So many palaces. What extraordinary resolution. What men. These are indeed Scythians." Having dallied too long in anticipation of a peace deal, Napoleon lost even more men on the return march, once more largely the consequence of disease, starvation, and a lack of supplies. By December of 1812, he quit his troops and rushed to Paris to try to save his crumbling regime. By 1814, the Sixth Coalition was closing in on France, and despite Napoleon's impressive efforts in the 6 Days Campaign, he was dethroned and exiled to Elba. The following year, he returned for one last hurrah, crowning a lifetime of audacity with perhaps the most audacious act of all. "If any of you will shoot his emperor, here I am," he says to the men sent to capture him, thereby winning his country back by simply raising his hat. So began the 100 Days Campaign, culminating in Napoleon's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. There, the Duke of Wellington held out just long enough for Blucher's Prussians to arrive and seal Napoleon's fate. He was now exiled a second time, but further away to St. Helena, and though he would have visitors, the Duke of Wellington was sadly not among them. We therefore get no exchange as the one thought to have occurred between Hannibal and Scipio. Yet, from afar, the Duke of Wellington would pay his respects, declaring that Napoleon's mere presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men. Even more intriguingly, when the question that was put to Hannibal was put to the Duke, the question of who the greatest captain in military history was, his reply tells us much. In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this new format, be sure to like and comment to let me and the almighty algorithm know. If you're interested in more casual historical content, deep dives, rabbit holes, tier lists, and iceberg charts, consider becoming a channel member or patron. So far, I've been putting out one exclusive piece of content monthly, but I'm hoping to up that to once a week very soon. Thanks again for watching, and let me know who I should cover next.